12 Golden Age stars abuse their husbands. The thing Hollywood's been selling you for decades is a lie. Those gorgeous, glamorous leading ladies of the Golden Age weren't always the soft, delicate beauties the studio publicity machines made them out to be. Behind perfect smiles and fluttering eyelashes lay some of the most vicious husband abusers the public never heard about. While male stars were dragged through the mud for bad behavior, these women got away with absolute brutality behind mansion doors. The studio system buried every bruise, every black eye, every broken bone under glossy photographs and glowing stories of happy Hollywood marriages. Today, the bandage gets ripped off Hollywood's dirtiest secret, the 12 beloved female stars who terrorized, tortured, and traumatized the men who made the mistake of saying "I do." These weren't difficult divas. They were domestic abusers with movie star faces and studio protection. Number 1. Joan Crawford, Hollywood's most terrifying wife. Joan Crawford, America's sweetheart on screen, but a nightmare at home, hid her fury behind perfectly sculpted brows and immaculate suits. Her third husband, actor Philip Terry, didn't just marry a movie star, he married a storm. Household staff later revealed that Crawford didn't argue. She attacked. Glasses, vases, hairbrushes, anything in reach became a weapon. During one explosive fight, she hurled a silver hairbrush so hard it split open Terry's temple, and the studio brushed it off with he fell. The physical violence was only the beginning. Crawford's true specialty was psychological destruction. For hours she listed every one of Terry's supposed failures as acting, his personality, even his existence. When she followed threats with bruises, Terry stayed silent because crossing Joan meant crossing the entire studio system. Years later, she summed up her philosophy with chilling simplicity. Men are pretty, but disposable. In her home, husbands weren't partners. They were targets. Number 2. Tallulah Bankhead, verbal torture as an art form. Tallulah Bankhead didn't need fists. She had a lethal tongue. Hollywood adored her wit, her smoky voice, and her outrageous humor. But her husband, actor John Emery, lived through the darker side of that charm. Bankhead specialized in public humiliation. She turned dinner parties into arenas where she carved up Emery's dignity. She mocked his intelligence, often dismissing him in mid-sentence and shaming him in front of guests who laughed nervously. Her favorite target, his masculinity. She held forth publicly on their sex life, making graphic, belittling comparisons that left him shattered. Fueled by alcohol and cocaine, she sometimes followed him from room to room, hurling insults until he collapsed. It was like watching somebody get skinned alive with words, said a housekeeper. Emery's divorce filing cited mental cruelty and understatement, if there ever was one, according to people who witnessed it. Bankhead treated emotional destruction like performance art, and Hollywood clapped along while she destroyed her husband. Number 3. Zsa Zsa Gabor, 9 husbands, multiple assault allegations. Zsa Zsa Gabor collected husbands like accessories, but many of them left with more than heartbreak, they left with bruises. Her sparkling interviews never mentioned the violent outbursts behind closed doors. Her 6th husband, Jack Ryan, inventor of the Barbie doll, filed police reports claiming Gabor physically assaulted him, including an attack with a hairbrush that sent him for stitches. Studios disguised it as fiery Hungarian passion, as if abuse became charming with an accent. Another husband, Felipe de Alba, annulled after one day, endured a wine glass thrown in his face and threats with a letter opener. Other husbands dodged flying telephones, vases, and even a small television. Staff often cleaned up what they called after the battles. Even her final husband wasn't spared, with leaks suggesting she once struck him with a cane during an argument. Gabor laughed off her behavior with lines about teaching men how to behave, but the bruises told a different story. Her famous quip about keeping houses after divorces hides the fact that the men barely escaped the chaos inside them. Number 4. Bette Davis. Those famous eyes witnessed domestic terror. Bette Davis's intense eyes captivated moviegoers, but to her husbands they signaled incoming emotional devastation. She didn't bother hiding her contempt. At social events, she dismantled her husband Arthur Farnsworth's dignity one sharp comment at a time, interrupting and humiliating him publicly. At home, it got worse. Staff heard Davis perform cruel, theatrical monologues, mocking his insecurities, his background, even his mannerisms, leaving him emotionally shattered. She targeted weaknesses with sniper-like precision. A studio executive once said she treated arguments like target practice. Her goal was to draw emotional blood. Farnsworth died in 1943 after a fall that caused a skull fracture. While Davis wasn't implicated, those close to him said he had been planning to leave, describing life with her as living inside a tornado. Her next husband escaped with the words, "I'd rather live in poverty than be her punching bag." Davis didn't just play difficult characters. She lived as one, and the men in her life paid the price. Number 5. Barbara Stanwyck. Cold dominance in a power marriage. Barbara Stanwyck played tough dames on screen, but off-screen she didn't need to act. Her husband of 11 years, Robert Taylor, became the unwilling participant in one of Hollywood's most quietly brutal campaigns of emotional domination. Their marriage, beginning in 1939, looked flawless in fan magazines. In reality, Taylor had stepped into a decade of psychological captivity. Older, wealthier, and far more established, Stanwyck didn't just wear the pants. She hid his. Unlike the screamers and object throwers on this list, Stanwyck's tactics were icy, calculated, and relentless. She never needed to raise her voice. She had power, and she wielded it like a scalpel. Stanwyck controlled every aspect of Taylor's life, starting with his career. She picked his scripts and vetoed projects. She read his contracts before he did. Studio heads soon learned that hiring Taylor meant negotiating with Stanwyck. One MGM producer said they weren't hiring an actor. They were borrowing him from Barbara. At home she ruled with military precision. Taylor had to get permission for even the most mundane of decisions, from what he ate to whom he saw. He reported his whereabouts constantly, while she came and went as she pleased. When he once chafed against the double standard, she replied, reportedly, that his only job was to be available when she wanted him, and her job was to decide when that would be. Her most devastating tactic was emotional withdrawal. Stanwyck doled out affection as if it were currency, rewarding obedience and punishing independence. If Taylor pushed back even slightly, she froze him out for days or weeks until he apologized for offenses he often didn't understand. Friends watched the once charming, confident Taylor become a muted shadow who looked to Stanwyck for permission before speaking. At public events, he stood slightly behind her as if waiting for direction. His service in World War II gave him a rare taste of freedom. When he returned more assertive, Stanwyck switched between icy rejection and sudden displays of affection, keeping him off balance. Emotional exhaustion eventually pushed Taylor toward other women. When confronted, he told Stanwyck that at least they treated him like a person rather than property. Their marriage collapsed in 1950. Director George Stevens later said Taylor looked like a man recovering from a long illness. Stanwyck's greatest performance wasn't in front of a camera. It was the illusion that her control was simply a modern marriage rather than a one-woman re-education camp designed to erase her husband's identity. Number 6. Gloria Swanson. 6 Marriages of Manipulation. Gloria Swanson didn't just act in Sunset Boulevard. She lived it. She was the queen of the silent screen and the terror of every man who tried to be her partner. 6 husbands entered her world, and 6 learned the harsh truth of what it meant to marry someone who believed relationships existed solely to support her stardom. Her 4th husband, Michael Farmer, left the most detailed accounts. Court documents described a life of constant emotional turmoil. He never knew which Gloria he'd face, the charming celebrity or the raging tyrant. The shift was sudden, dramatic, and often strategic. Swanson's emotional storms were the stuff of legend. She used them tactically, often creating chaos the night before important business meetings, so that Farmer would be exhausted and fragile when she appeared perfectly composed. Her need for control veered into bizarre territory. She controlled her husband's clothes, friends, and even the books he read. Her 5th husband, William Davey, said she once burned a book of poetry because she didn't like his expression while reading it. Money became another tool of domination. She underwrote her husband's projects, then pulled the funding whenever they showed independence, creating deliberate economic dependence. One ex-husband said living with Swanson felt like owing money to a loan shark who changed the interest rates based on obedience. While she was privately destroying her husbands, Swanson mastered the art of preserving her public image. Through each divorce, she came out dignified, wronged, and elegant while her ex-husbands were opportunists. Even her last husband, William Dufty, who stayed with her until she died, would say to friends that she never lost that need for control. Billy Wilder knew exactly what he was doing when he cast her as Norma Desmond. When asked why, he said he needed someone who didn't require much direction to play a woman who destroys the men she claims to love. Swanson delivered elegance to the world and absolute hell to her husbands. Every marriage license became a hunting permit. Number 7. Mae West. Domination as lifestyle. When Mae West purred "Come up and see me sometime," the men in her life should have read the fine print. Relationships came with terms and conditions, and dignity was rarely included. Her most shocking secret was a marriage she denied for decades. In 1911, prior to Hollywood stardom, she had married vaudeville performer Frank Wallace. And when stardom arrived, she didn't simply separate from him. She erased him. For more than 20 years, she denied ever having been married to him until he publicly produced the certificate in 1935. While denying the marriage existed, she paid him for silence in an arrangement closer to captivity than marriage. According to Wallace's later accounts, Mae summoned him when it was convenient for her and dismissed him when she lost interest. Friends who knew the situation described how she belittled him in private, mocking his failed career and reminding him of her power. She made him use the service entrance when visiting to avoid public association. In private, she called him the mistake instead of calling him by his name. Beyond Wallace, other men in her life described similar patterns. She dictated their clothes, manner of speech, and their availability. One former boyfriend said that being with her felt like auditioning daily for a part you could lose without warning. Paul Novak, her final companion, was supposed to be available at any hour, but had no right to complain when she sent him away. When one partner made a decision without consulting her, she invited him to a dinner party, only to have her guests ignore his presence completely on her command. He sat for 3 hours, treated like a ghost in a dramatic manner, to make a point. West's money created a power imbalance that she manipulated. Benefits going to compliant partners, punishment for the merest hint of rebellion. When Wallace finally exposed their marriage to the public, West gaslighted him, telling people that he was the imposter and acting as if she barely remembered him. She was the queen in her kingdom, and the males in her life merely subjects who were supposed to play along and take orders from her. Anyone forgetting the pecking order was reminded very swiftly. Number 8. Clara Bow. The it girl with a violent streak. Clara Bow, Hollywood's original it girl, had more than charisma and beauty. She also carried deep emotional wounds that sometimes exploded into violence. Unlike the calculated abusers on this list, Bow's behavior came from genuine psychiatric suffering. Her childhood had been a battlefield of starvation, neglect, sexual assault, and a mentally unstable mother who once held a knife to her throat. These traumas carved scars into her psyche that never fully healed. When she married actor and Nevada rancher Rex Bell in 1931, he inherited her pain along with her fame. Bow's episodes often included throwing things, hitting Bell, and breaking property. During a 1933 dinner party, after being both drunk and provoked, she hit Bell hard enough to show visible bruises. Guests remained silent as if nothing happened. Staff reported that sometimes Bell slept in locked rooms following her violent episodes. A particularly frightening incident occurred when she reportedly tried to strike him with a fireplace poker in a fight over money. In her early 30s, Bow retreated from Hollywood, where later doctors would say she likely suffered from bipolar disorder, PTSD, and perhaps schizophrenia. Bell remained patient, loyal, and silent, staying married to her through his death, though they increasingly lived separate lives. The tragedy of Clara Bow's story was that her abusive behavior was the symptom of untreated mental illness in an era offering little help and intense stigma. other women on this list weaponized cruelty, but Bao was a wounded woman at war with her mind, and sometimes the people closest to her became casualties. She had it, and when her trauma overwhelmed her, she used it like a weapon she couldn't control. Number 9. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was frequently referred to as the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, and she became Frank Sinatra's unlikely nemesis, demolishing his tough guy image. When they came together in 1949, their relationship wasn't just volatile, it was a war zone. Sinatra, despite his mob connections and public swagger, was no match for Gardner's volcanic temper behind closed doors. Friends and staff frequently saw Gardner erupt over the tiniest provocation, or sometimes none at all. Arguments quickly escalated into one-sided assaults, in which she hurled whatever object was nearest. More than one incident left Sinatra with injuries he had to cover up, including a notorious moment when Gardner struck him with a silver hairbrush hard enough to require stitches. Studios became adept at explaining away Sinatra's bruises and cuts. Her verbal attacks were just as brutal. At one point when Sinatra's career was tanking, Gardner picked at his deepest insecurities, making fun of his height, demeaning his dying fame, and even calling him a has-been. She would openly flirt with others or demean him at parties with cutting remarks that left entire rooms speechless. Alcohol only made things worse, and their wars exploded from Hollywood to Europe. Yet through it all, Sinatra was emotionally chained to her, confessing she was the only woman he had ever feared. The marriage survived a mere 6 years, ending in 1957, but even after it, their affair remained tough to untangle. Sinatra would say later only, "She broke my heart." Gardner replied, "She hardly tried." Between their two statements lies the truth of a dynamic where power flipped completely, leaving Sinatra permanently scarred by a woman he couldn't stop loving. Number 10. Susan Hayward. Susan Hayward's intensity on screen was as nothing compared to the chaos she wrought at home. Her 1944 marriage to actor Jess Barker produced twins, but played out like a war zone rather than a residence. Later, Barker would say he lived in constant terror, never knowing what minor oversight might set off another of Hayward's explosive fits. She could go off, divorce papers reported, over a mislaid object or his being late by 5 minutes. Angered, she chased him room to room, ranting on for hours. Her verbal assaults were aimed with painful precision. Barker's struggling career was a weapon she used constantly against him, telling him he was a failure and worthless. Friends said her outbursts were merciless in their attempt to destroy his self-confidence. It was physical as well. There were reports of her hurling glasses, books, and even a table lamp that missed his head, while their housekeeper would tidy up several times the objects she had smashed during these incidents. Publicly, Hayward might be just as cruel. At film and theater events, she would undermine Barker with stinging remarks, leaving those who overheard her aghast. As Hayward's career soared and Barker stalled, the imbalance grew even sharper. She mocked him for being dependent on her success, adding another layer of humiliation to the marriage. The breaking point came in 1954 after a violent argument that led Barker to call the police, a rare step for any man in that era, much less a public figure. Their divorce was bitter, with multiple witnesses confirming Barker's accounts of her uncontrollable rage. Hayward could shift from tears to fury in seconds, leaving a home ruled not by love, but by fear of her next explosion. Number 11. Lupez Vallés. Lupez Vallés was called the Mexican Spitfire, and she lived up to the name in ways most people never knew. Lupez Vallés' passionate and explosive relationship with Weissmuller bordered on notorious within Hollywood circles. They met in 1933, argued within an hour, and spent the next 5 years repeating that cycle in ways that became progressively more violent. Unlike others who depended upon thrown objects, Vallés often turned physically aggressive, leaving Weissmuller sporting visible injuries which the studios hastened to explain away. One of the most alarming incidents happened in 1935. Dinner guests were shocked to see Vallés chasing Weissmuller with a kitchen knife after he spoke briefly with another actress. Security had to intervene while Weissmuller locked himself in the bathroom. She later justified the attack by telling friends she had every right because he belonged to her. Their public altercations became infamous, with accounts of Valles slapping, scratching, and even biting him in restaurants or at industry functions. While some dismissed her actions as fiery passion, the reality was domestic violence. Her behavior was driven by jealousy. She was never off Weissmuller's arm and exploded at any perceived threat. Studios were forced to assign security to events where they both appeared in case Valles lost control. Standing tall and muscular, Weissmuller physically could have defended himself, but he refused to retaliate, choosing instead to restrain her or walk away. Privately, he admitted to friends that he often slept with his door locked because he feared her outbursts. Their marriage ended in 1938, and Valles' turbulent emotional life continued until her death in 1944. Behind the nickname that marketed her appeal was a woman whose destructive rage made even Tarzan himself afraid in his own home. Number 12. Miriam Hopkins. Miriam Hopkins didn't need fists or drunken tirades to inflict damage. She had something far more potent: strategic, calculated psychological warfare. Her marriage with director Anatole Litvak from 1937 to 1939 was defined not by explosive fights, but by a cold, methodical pattern of control. Already a major star, Hopkins used her influence with precision. Every conflict became a campaign, planned and executed with the intent of breaking Litvak's resistance, without leaving obvious evidence. One of the most harrowing incidents occurred when Litvak questioned her decision to fire a longtime household employee. Hopkins then had the locks changed on their home and instructed staff not to let him in. For 3 days, he stayed in a hotel while she refused all communication until he publicly apologized. Her methods didn't stop at the household. She manipulated information, lied about social happenings, rearranged his schedule, and then gaslit him when he called her out. At every turn, her tactics created confusion and self-doubt that left him questioning his very memory and judgment. After divorce, Hopkins took a different tack: professional sabotage. Never attacking Litvak directly, she spoke of her supposed concerns over his reliability only quietly to producers and studio executives. Her influence carried weight. Projects he was set to direct slipped away, replaced by others Hopkins preferred. One producer later admitted they rejected Litvak for a role simply because hiring him would mean dealing with Hopkins's potential backlash. Her campaign lasted years and seriously hindered Litvak's career. All the while, Hopkins was warm and charming in public, but behind the scenes, the manipulation was calculated. She didn't scream or throw things or bruise. She merely disassembled a man's confidence and career with the artistry of the director who blocks a scene. Her cruelty didn't leave marks, but it was deep, a reminder that abuse can come in many forms, some of them silent, strategic, and devastating.